On behalf of the Center for Poverty Analysis, I warmly welcome you to People's Spaces, beyond the intellectual cloud cover. 5 years after the end of the civil war in Sri Lanka, many of us often point to the transformation of Colombo as exemplary of the country's post-war reconstruction. Recently, the city of Colombo bid for the Lee Kuan Yew World City Prize for the Best Livable City Award in 2016. The creation of magnificent structures such as the Racecourse Complex, the Dutch Hospital Complex, other new public spaces, and the culture of walking paths are characteristic of Colombo's facelift. Now, I think, as residents of Colombo, we have conflicting perspectives on this transformation and respond to the evolution of this city in contradicting ways. On the one hand, we are deeply concerned about the gentrification of Colombo. We protest that the concentration of power structures, productive systems, and human capital, while generating new economic prospects for some, may also create greater inequality for others. The accuracy of our memory notwithstanding, we romanticize about the Colombo of the past, a friendly, embracing city, and make comparisons with the rapidly changing Colombo of the present, which we claim is increasingly welcoming to one segment of the population, while it is slowly closing its doors to a significant other constituency that is excluded from such networks, thereby prevented from benefiting fully from their basic rights as citizens. We are critical that one social segment of Colombo enjoys the privileges of economic security, safe and aesthetically pleasing places, and social security, while another important part of Colombo's population is sentenced to displacement, vulnerability, poverty, or exclusion from the job market, services, and high-quality living environment. On the other hand, we are also the users of these new public spaces of Colombo. In the same breath that we criticize its transformation, we rejoice in the fact that there are new and safe places for social interaction. Our complaints about government spending on beautification contradict our appreciation of clean, spotless roads and beauty that surrounds us. Our anger over displacement of people living in underserved settlements contradicts our complacency of and even contribution to the capitalist processes of Colombo. At times we are thoroughly frustrated over the scripted nature of spaces that we view as hegemonic ploys to tame our minds, colonize our imagination, and clone fictitious citizens out of each one of us. Yet, this frustration is contradicted by the unique ways in which we use those very spaces to express ourselves. In this context, Colombo and its outskirts present an interesting case to observe the complex relationship between the city and its people. To help us understand the ways in which people negotiate their right to the city, today we have invited Professor Nihal Perera. Professor Perera is a professor of urban planning at Ball State University and director of CAP Asia Immersive Field Semester. He was a Fulbright Scholar in China from 2006 to 2007 and Senior Research Fellow at the National University of Singapore in 2010. His publications include Transforming Asian Cities, Decolonizing Ceylon, Politics of Space in Sri Lanka, Contesting Visions in Chandigarh, and Feminizing the City. He's currently working on a volume of People's Spaces. I warmly welcome you to the Space for Interaction, Professor Perera. And you can make your presentation now. People's Spaces, familiarizing colonial Colombo.
Let me start with something something small. One of my students from Sri Lanka studied how the people in Gulfport, which is a World Heritage site, live on a day-to-day basis. And when she returned after her master's, one of her uncles asked, did you go to America to study this? Why didn't you study something big like GIS or some technology or something like that? I personally think we as most academics and professionals try to focus on these big things, they kind of miss small things. And I will also try, try to avoid a little bit this big controversy in Colombo, because sometimes you need to get involved, sometimes you can do other work which might actually provide some paths into that, and so I'm going to focus on a book that I'm working on, which is called People Spaces. The very simple idea is kind of, we know so much about what the governance and the capital is doing, but how do people live in these places? Even to in today's debate, like about Colombo, focuses a lot on what the government is doing. I think it's also time for us to kind of like talk about people. I do not necessarily, I do not take people as kind of like an undifferentiated category, but again, like within this few minutes, I don't have much time to elaborate on all these concepts. But let me highlight, let me get on with a particular story, which actually is from a piece that I already published, which is also going to be the key piece, the key chapter of this book, which will drive, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the book as we go on. Probably most of you know, if not all of you, that there was a massive transformation in Colombia in the 1860s to 1880s. Perhaps much bigger than what is happening right now. Maybe it's a nice comparison. And of course, however, I'm wondering, maybe the transformation is much greater than the one that we know. Of course, like to highlight, to highlight what happened. There was the expansion of the harbor, the demolition of fortifications, the establishment of the Colombo Municipal Council, the expansion of the British cultural space. There is the building of cinema gardens and race courses, and so on, which are in the headlines these days. And there was a massive transformation of this nature. For me, was culminated by the construction of the museum. Because museum actually, for me, represents how one culture, which is the Georgian building, houses another culture, which is actually subjugated, and kind of like to say, well, we've done it, this is what it is. We've become the guardians, the Georgians have become the guardians of local culture, Sinhalese or Sri Lankan, or I would like to call it Lankan before the colonialism culture. I would also argue, since my studies address colonial urban development, that is also when Colombo became the colonial capital. In my work, I argue Colombo was contested. Colombo's position was contested most of the time. This was kind of like one period when it was like uncontested. Like all of a sudden, Colombo was not the port city, the colonial port city. It was the capital of this colony. All of a sudden. Here, I'm also kind of like alluding to, I'm not going to elaborate on all these things, I'm also alluding to the idea, something that I've argued in my book, Decolonizing Ceylon. Contrary to the historical ideas that rural areas kind of like give rise to urban areas and so on, Ceylon never produced Colombo, Colombo produced Ceylon, and this country as we know it today. So changes became visible. I think at that time it became a global city. In some ways it was called the Clapham Junction of the East. Many ships that passed this area stopped there for coaling and various other purposes. People kind of like came out and shopped and stayed in hotels, and so on. So this cave building, which is up there, is about 400 feet long. You know, like so. So it shows what a big city that was. Actually, it was not a national city; it was an international city, because a national city cannot support this. The local, the Ceylon couldn't support this. Now, the explanation for this massive transformation is the coffee plantations succeeded, and I'm putting the dates in 1850s, because in my own work I've argued the plantations came to stay here between the 1830s and 1850s. However, I'm just wondering whether whether we go beyond colonialism in regard to, like, is this like academic colonialism in some sense, or intellectual colonialism? Because people like Brenda Yo has kind of like argued studies have largely focused on the uncontested supremacy of European colonizers, and which is what the story that I said right now. Spivak talks about assuming that imperialism began in Europe itself is Eurocentric. Even tyranny didn't begin there. Kandy Kingdom was also not a kind of like great place to live in at some point. So for Lankans, anyway, during this time, the land became unfamiliar. The place became dehistoricized. Connecting to another history. It was very disoriented. But I'm asking, for me, I'm sure there's another story behind this. We are talking about a very small minority in Colombo who made this transformation. If I may go into the academic side of the story, people like Lafave, David Harvey picks up on this and elaborates. They talk about a vast range of spaces. However, there's a strong focus on absolute space, the raw physical space that is out there, and abstract space that is produced by powerful dominant actors like the state and the capital. The question for me is, like even in Lafave's triad, what happens to live space? Can we how do ordinary people, or how did ordinary people respond to these spaces during that time? How do they live in such spaces? How do they accommodate their daily activities and cultural practices in these alien spaces? In so doing, will they be transforming space? Right? This book argues yes, and this is how it is. When you live in somebody else's space, whether it's government or planners or policymakers or whoever's space, you have to find accommodation, because you're not a policymaker, you're not a planner, you have to kind of like live your life. And how do you live life? You have to find accommodation in this. Sometimes you fight back, sometimes people get angry and sort of do big things. Sometimes they negotiate in small ways. Even to become subjects of a space, you cannot become a subject of a space without understanding this particular space. So the issue is, can we look at this story not just from a colonial standpoint, but from a Lankan standpoint or Sri Lankan standpoint? So when I investigate this story, I see something big missing even in the mainstream story. One is actually, for me, what happened in Colombo during that time was the British becoming very confident. They were not restricted to the fort area. They kind of went and created their own cultural space, created their suburb or the residential district, and their cultural spaces like race courses, cricket pitches, and various other things. For me, I would argue there's a strong political dimension to this, because it's very easy. A lot of people, including sometimes the hardline political economists, use economy to kind of like explain things. Because I think it's in my view it's political, because I think it's 1848 rebellion, or as we know it, once the British defeated all the uprisings in 1917 and 1848 rebellion, that's when they became very comfortable. You know, not when they took over in 1815, Candy or 12 the rebellion in 1817, but 1848 was definitely a time when they became very comfortable. This has been written about. I'm sure most of you have read about the 1848 rebellion. For me, in regard to space, social space, the transformation of society and space do not happen in tandem at the same time. Right? To use some lingo, to put it that way, the transformation of space and society is neither isotemporal nor isomorphic. You know, I mean, they don't change the same way, nor at the same time. Like, just because Sri Lanka got independence, the whole colonial environment didn't change the next day. It takes time. So there's some time lag. So for me, this is what we're seeing. The main political change took place in 48. There was a definitive change, and we see the bigger changes over time in the late 19th century. And when I delve into this, I'm also kind of seeing that indigenization, that means localization. If we look at what the local people did, indigenization is pretty much integral to colonialism. You can't separate this because a local person, if a local person works in the colonial administration, the local person actually has to work, has to understand what this colonial system is. And the local person is not a Brit, right? You know, and does not work in this particular culture. So one cannot fully transform into a Brit. So what happens is kind of like, you know, it becomes halfway through in some ways. So in some ways, I think a dominant process to be successful, or for a dominant structure, you know, like dominant transformation to be successful, it has to fail in a mainstream sense. To take an example, you know, like I used to get I have 3 kids, you know, I used to get the kids to kind of like sometimes wash dishes and so on, kind of like, you know, teach them, you know, like how to become a part of the household. And my son, you know, when he washes dishes, he would make a huge sound, down, you know, because he doesn't like, you know, he wants to play. And my wife starts yelling at him, you know, like, and saying, you know, like, this is not how you do it. I tell my wife, if you keep doing this, eventually you will be washing the dishes and he will be playing. That's exactly what happens, you know. I mean, so you can also relate this to the weapons of the week, in that sense. But also, you cannot kind of like expect everything to be so perfect. This is how I want you to wash dishes. This is exactly how you wash dishes. No, I want you to do this task. You do it your way. So in some ways, there is a connection here. I mean, there's a connection and a disconnection. So in regard to space also, you can't expect people to live, local people to live in a colonial space. So I think there's a case to be made. You know, like, I mean, if one is interested in, we can ask, how did they transform this from an exclusive domain of colonial power to a place that's not that unfriendly, right? A place where you can speak blood or something like that. So when I look at this, I see most of you already know much of what I'm going to talk about, but it is not formulated in this particular way. Social space has not been a kind of a big study until very recent times. Colombo was transformed also by the elite, the rising elite, the emergence of the national elite, migration of workers, naturalization. That was kind of like various people who were trained in Colombo who were not locals, naturalization, and the revival of Buddhism. These are quite well-known stories. The capitalist class, if you will, emerged in number. I mean, the story of the emergence, Michael Roberts and Kumar Javan and them have written extremely well. But in regard to space, of course, there was during this time, various businessmen were able to kind of infiltrate into like places like Fort and so on. Like there were Mark and Marker, and so like there were various stores that were owned by the local people that were infiltrating into the Fort area, basically during that time. And in a larger sense, you all know that the locals, the Ceylonese, complemented the plantation space as well. They expanded it in some ways. They were complicit. Yet at the same time, they were contested. And the locals dominated in certain areas like transportation until the advent of the railways, and also the Arak business and so on. Again, another story that most of you know is kind of like, their dwelling environments. Kumar Javadar has written as well much about this. Changed. Much of these dwelling environments were built very close to the colonial built environments, following the colonial built environments. Yet at the same time, they were named, in a local sense. The practices were local and so on. It was not the Europeans who lived in these things. Then the other category, the workers. Once the colonials have won, that also means that the locals will have to kind of like follow that path. What does that really mean to people who do not have much wealth and so on? They have to find employment. So it's interesting to see, like maybe the colonials would drive a train from Colombo to Jaffna, because it is in a way establishing Colombo's authority. For the people in Jaffna, there's a train that goes from Jaffna to Colombo, right? So there's this very interesting use of the instruments of the power, basically, the colonial spaces or instruments, to come the other way around. And they created large settlements around the port and Peta, around the port and Peta and various other places in Colombo, which actually the administrators and planners and policymakers and so on would consider to be slums and shanties, and talk about them in very derogatory ways. In this particular case, it's very interesting to see they were solving a problem of not having adequate affordable housing by actually using the houses, large houses that were left by the elite or the colonials or whoever else, and many families living there so that they could afford them. Right? Of course, the authorities would call them slums, And then they would also use building methods that they brought from the rural areas and built, but using urban material, which the authorities would call shanties. It's interesting to see. This is actually indigenizing. This is the Ceylonization of Colombo in many ways. Some remnants of these things are still around. These are not necessarily the best pictures, but I'm talking about something like this. Then of course, there was naturalization, which I didn't talk about. I don't have a slide for that. The adaptation, the people who came to trade and do various things were here, after with the British rule, the movements were a little bit restricted, so they gradually settled. And also the Portuguese brought their hatred towards Muslims and so on. So the King of Kandy settled Muslims in Akurana and Batiklo and that kind of stuff, those areas. So these changes of kind of like the settling of this so-called non-natives or non-natives, which I would call naturalization. And there are various ways in which scholars and others have talked about the so-called Buddhist revival, or if you use Galanatha Visegra's thesis, Gombrich and Visegra's thesis, the Protestantization of Buddhism. Buddhist institutions, which lost its main patron in Kandy, the King of Kandy, this establishment, moved to Colombo in various forms, in the form of like schools, which were pretty much like, schools like Anand and Anand, which were pretty much, one would argue, following missionary schools, printing presses, various societies, activities. Much of its built environment was kind of like big, and evident in the outskirts, like Kalvi Temple and so on. But Buddhism was there also in Peta, so there were societies. But it was within a colonial environment. So it's interesting to see there was a very conspicuous and not really conspicuous, very evident environment on the outskirts, and kind of like not very evident environment or conspicuous presence of Buddhism from a built environment standpoint in the middle of the city. So again, I think the point that I'm trying to make is we cannot understand cities by just looking at the elite and the urban development regulations and the minister's interest or views or whatever, because the cities are much larger, and greater than that. Many actors are involved in making Colombo even during this time, and the history is much greater than the history that's kind of written and one could read. Indigenization itself, again, I'm putting all these ideas in like a simplified form because I'm talking and I want to make sure, I'm communicating. But these are very complex ideas. Indigenization, I'm not saying that indigenization is people come and indigenize colonial space. Indigenization also involves the westernization of the subject. The subject comes and the subject accepts colonialism and comes and the subject itself westernizes. Yet at the same time, it's totally incomplete. The subject cannot totally westernize. The subject also localizes the space, in order to sort of like carry out cultural practices and daily activities and cultural practices of these people, which are also modified. They can't carry out all that they used to. Yet at the same time, they don't give up everything that they used to. They don't become Western. So it's a pretty combination of this. When we use the terms like hybridity, it doesn't necessarily mean there's a concrete thing called hybrid. It's pretty much a way in which we highlight that these categories that we use, the oppositions, cannot actually explain this sufficiently, and we probably need other categories to kind of explain this. So the city, in a sense, if you want me to kind of like describe this in a very broad, simplistic way, the city marked by clock towers and Georgian buildings at its center was infiltrated by Buddhist and rural forms of buildings, which the British called huts, which the British were determined to keep out of the city. The huts they didn't want in the city. So it's a very interesting place, actually, if you want to sort of like get into this and try and understand. Another major thing that happened in the city was Colombo became a contested city. Colombo was, all cities are contested, every space is contested in some ways, but this became a very specifically contested city at that point. Earlier, there was a conflict between Kandy and Colombo, right? People who didn't like Colombo rallied around Kandy. They were trying to fight, the fights until 1815 and 1817 uprising and various uprisings in 1848 and so on. But now, once it's lost, and once this process that I talked about happened, Kandy is still an important center. This conflict comes into Colombo because now you have the Buddhist establishment, much more local people, and so on. They are pretty much indigenizing this. Indigenizing begins at the peak of capitalism, peak of colonialism, basically. It's almost like the two sides of the same coin. Another major thing that happened during this time, we can keep going on this, is that this city was transformed from an exclusive domain of the power holders to a milieu that also supported indigenous populations. In a sense, it is hard to think of the city as a colonial city, based on our understandings that we have at present. Anthony King, whom I consider to be the authority or one of the authorities of colonial urbanism, has written very nicely how the cities were divided, again, put simplistically, into white cities and black cities. The white city had all the power institutions, the military, the governor, the courts, later on the parliament and everything. And you go to the native city or the black city, which was full of like barbers and shoemakers and so on, which makes a lot of sense. Nevertheless, I would argue this particular transformation that happened in the 1860s to 1880s actually brought in a power institution to the other side too, which the Buddhist institutions were power institutions for full of course. So there was a huge contestation that was happening. There were debates, like against the colonials, against the Protestants, and so on. So let me elaborate, expand this Colombo story, because that's, Colombo story, I took that, I used the specific term indigenization, right? And I'll tell you a little bit more about feminization. If I may kind of look at this in a larger sense, using familiarization, indigenization as familiarization. We all familiarize space. You all have familiarized this particular space by being here and by attending this event and doing it in your own way, basically. So one of the big places that I learned about this concept was this book by James Holston. He wrote this book on Brasilia and how the Brazilians, the Brazilian people, rejected the Brazilian utopian design by reasserting their family values, conceptions and conventions of human life. It's a fantastic concept. He does a good job. But I would like to go beyond this duality. It's not like they bring the former values and try to kind of replace the new values that were established in Brasilia. But these are all kind of like, I would focus on how subjects negotiate their own, like third spaces, created in more discrete ways. And third spaces is because you're going beyond this too, that doesn't necessarily mean there's only one third space. So I also refer to both familiar practices adapted to new contexts and also new activities developed within these contexts, because now it's a new environment. So, as I said at the earlier little example about my own son, I think these small things. If you want to understand the larger system, almost every system has exceptions, right? If you want to understand the larger systems, you can only understand the larger system at the operational level by recognizing that that norm at the local level is in fact is necessary for the larger structure to survive, and we need to kind of pay attention to that. I understand the duality, wanting to do revolutions, like wanting to change, capture the capitalist state and transform it. I understand, and I have given my life to that as well. But I think it's much bigger. So, following this kind of ideas, I also wrote a piece entitled "Feminizing the City." Of course, I was quite interested in trying to understand how the Colombo city, which was created by the Portuguese as a young white male Christian city, where the soldados who when they got married, they were asked to leave the fort, basically. And of course, like much easier to kind of understand these stories as black and white, big stories, colonized, indigenized, indigenous, white male, indigenous female type of issues. But when I look at it, it is far more complex than that. I'm not going into all these details, but if I may. It was interesting for me to figure out how women in Colombo, which includes Portuguese women and Dutch women and British women also, how first nestled within the domestic sphere, these third spaces were extended into the public sphere, later by missionary and socialist women. Kumar Javan has written much about this as well. My contribution is coming from a spatial standpoint. So I became much interested in this idea of familiarization in a larger sense. How are cities transformed from exclusive domains of the power holders to milieux which support indigenous social and cultural practices? One thing I learned was I myself was surprised to see how fast the city was indigenized. The process started. It's not like indigenization begins after independence or something. I'm also finding, as a planning educator, yesterday Nalini said I'm a geographer, whatever the label that fits me. How much we miss on the ordinary city. I see there are three major reasons why we miss this city. The cloud cover is kind of created by three factors, if not more, but at least three necessary factors. One is the focus. One student came to me and told me that she's from Sikkim, from Gangtok. She told me she wants to do a thesis about on the built environment of Gangtok, and what she wanted to study was I asked, why do you want to study Sikkim? Why do you want to study Gangtok? What's important about that? She said Gangtok is very ugly because people. She's an architect. She said it's very ugly. There's beautiful mountains and everything. The people have actually made it very ugly. I said, I'm an architect, I fully understand what you're talking about, but I'm absolutely uninterested in this because it's a very outside-in view about this. And I asked her, would you be really interested in going and asking them, why did you build these ugly things? And trying to figure out why do they build these ugly places? And to try to understand why do people build the places the way they build. And she did this thesis, a fabulous thesis, one person builds and there's an empty lot right in front, and somebody comes and tells, the government is going to give this empty lot to somebody else, and then the guy goes to the government and uses influence to get the lot to him and pays money to this other guy, and then builds something on that which he absolutely doesn't need, it's how is the built environment produced? I'm an architect and a planner. One of my journeys, that led to decolonizing Ceylon was asking, why do people build the way they build? Why did I build? Where did I get these ideas as an architect or a planner? It's a self-examination in a certain sense. So I think we need to look at the right places to find, if you want to find people's spaces. Secondly, we need to use proper analytical tools. I don't know whether we have much analytical tools to understand people, because that's not what we do in the academia or in the professional world. Because if you use a political economy framework, you will see whatever that takes us to. That means we will see neoliberalism or class struggle or something like that, which are important, but that's not what people produce. Actually, sometimes I should be brave to say this. Sometimes the political economists forget. Karl Marx actually did not think of the working class as victims. Karl Marx thought of the working class as survivors who can actually transform the society. That was his message, and then this much of the neoliberal discourse or critique is about, like how the people have been victimized. Yes, of course there is that. But I think we also have a responsibility to try and understand how people are actually survivors. How are they fighting? How are they kind of like trying to avoid this? Where are they going? How can we be a part of that? Rather than asking people to become a part of what we do. So I think frameworks are very significant, in regard to what we can see and what we've seen, we do have, I understand, we had coming from a planning, housing type of standpoint, we had fantastic policies like the support systems, during the Million Houses program, proposed by Social Development, and the national plan, which kind of requires which brought the politicians into the planning process. So we need to actually really identify these things. Thirdly, we have to use an appropriate vantage point, because if we want to see people's faces. Scott Boland's who writes about Israel says that people in Israel have no doubt that the plans that the planners have made are brilliant. The infrastructure, the whatever. But that is of no value, no use to the people, because it does not address people's issue. As you said right at the beginning about the current current transformations, and they say our issue is to live peacefully. When Gaza is bombed and all these things. What is the use of a nice little plan that will supply water to some place? Of course you need water, but that's not what it is. I think rather than using sympathy, which much of the scholars as well as the policymakers and planners use, and engage in evangelical work, I think it's very important to look at the city from an empathic standpoint. What are they doing? So, to using all these things, I'm putting this book together. Some of these pieces are written. Indigenized in the city and feminized in the city, which I need to update and have in this book. But there are interesting questions to ask. How do people live in the Gulf, which is a World Heritage Site? How do people live in a World Heritage Site? Because the people who establish World Heritage Site do not think about the people. It's very interesting to see how the chief of the World Heritage Foundation thinks a little bit like a little bit aristocratic maybe, and don't necessarily talk very much with the local people. And then the people who work, they take bribes and they take, they have some women don't like them as well. I don't want to go into details, to be there. And Dharavi, Dharavi is considered to be the largest slum by some people, but it's in Mumbai. I was interested in this whole debate, this proposal, and then the whole debate surrounding this. How who is proposing what? And with a student, I did this study in Tashkent. In Tashkent, they have not built any houses, since the public housing or affordable housing or for the middle class since independence. So how would young people who leave homes to establish households, whether it's individually or with partners or whatever, where do they live? How do they produce their own dwelling spaces? And it's because they do produce. It's not like they're dead. This comes from a piece that I've written. This whole debate about the war, during the war, it was about the government and the LTT. Whenever it was talked about we need peace, or the government and the LTT needs to come together, we need to bring them to the table. I understand. I understand the logic. But how about asking the question, What did people produce during this time? You know, people also did exist. They moved from place to place. They moved from this country to other countries. They moved from cities to other cities. They moved from islands to cities. How did they restructure this? And complete lack of understanding of this, what people produce in regard to space as well as culture and various other things, we can say, okay, the war is over, now you can go back. Where would you go back to? Because I have lived here for 25 years. My kids are here. You know, somebody's married here. So, I mean, it's really interesting to ask you, like, what about these people? I mean, what have they been producing? And I also did a study on calamity, where after the tsunami, of course the NGOs and the government and everybody had plans, and they were moved 5 kilometers away, and the NGOs gave money and built houses. They started building their own kitchens and various things, and they transformed that space into something that's useful for them. And it's not a process that would end. Recovery never meant that they went back to the same place where they were. You know, as most people who got engaged thought about. So I'm not going to bore you with all these details, but I think you get the idea. You know, and then I'm very much interested in the idea of the handi. You know, how is a handi produced? You know, produced and reproduced. One of my students at Moratu did a very nice undergraduate thesis. I mean, it's not a very deep. It's an undergraduate thesis which I'm developing with her into a chapter in this book. But it's a space that people create. You know, that people create in this country, and that's a very significant space with which I grew up in this country. And it's amazing to see, you know, how this space never shows up in planning documents or any significant documents, which use like some foreign language, like it has nodes and landmarks, and I mean, all these different things, but never the local space that we know. So each place, I mean, this is from a book, a recent book by Joseph Allen. Each place has a history, a story of contingencies and changes, layers of production and construction, often reaching back through the decades and centuries that informed its contemporary condition. So this is the kind of work that I'm doing. It's really interesting to see, like when you go, you know, I mean, this is very American idea to have hamburgers, I believe. And this hamburger actually is not a bun, but it's rice, you know, which comes from Japan. So this is in Taipei, right? So two buns made out of rice, you know, with a piece of meat in the middle. So I mean, how people adopt and adapt, and actually, in some ways, how do they really defeat? In some ways, I personally think, you know, like, I mean, I'm coming from a planning policy, that kind of standpoint. If we can understand what people are doing, it's much easier to work with them to transform places if one wishes to transform, rather than saying that we need like urban renewal or something like that, which I think it's a problem of the 20th century. I'm yet to see a successful place where the built environment has been improved along with the people living there, rather than displacing them. Thank you very much.